Good afternoon and welcome to another in our series of LinkedIn live events. What's keeping you awake at night? What if your business partner? So my name is Damian Connelly and I am Managing Director and founder of Secure Business Solutions, which is an accountancy practice where we have offices in London and in Dublin. But what I spend most of my time doing now is working as a fractional CFO for growing businesses, typically over £1 million, €1 million and above, but also then working with business owners who've grown their business to a certain size and are now considering whether to step back, whether to sell or exit their business, so that they can hopefully end up with what is a life-changing sum of money following their transaction. So today I just want to talk about the issue of business partners and owning businesses, growing businesses, and the excitement and the entrepreneurial spirit between those business partners. But what I see as fractional CFO from time to time, more often than maybe you might think, is problems or challenges or disputes in those business partnerships leading. There's the good, the bad, and the ugly. So in today's session, I want to run through the good, the bad, the ugly, and then my own view in terms of how I think business owners can make those relationships work a little bit better, perhaps head off problems before they arise. But even more than that, then when they do arise, have an ability to deal with those challenges or issues in as professional and straightforward a way as possible. So that's what we're going to try and cover off today. So I think we just start at the start, which is many business owners start their business on their own. They have a vision, they have an idea, they start working with their business, and eventually bring some staff on board to help them on that journey. However, there are also a number of business owners who work with two, maybe more people, and so they're not just a one-man band as they start their journey. And really what they have is they've got someone with a similar outlook, someone with a similar drive, and an ambition to achieve the same things that they want to achieve. They've also got someone who helps them get things off the ground in the business. And they also typically have someone who complements their skills. So maybe that someone is really, really good at the creative side of things, but they need someone who's got the organizational skills. In some cases, there might be someone who's fantastic at sales and marketing, but actually what they have is a business partner then who's really good at the customer service, the organization, maybe even the financials. But I guess the other thing to think about when you're working with a business partner is that you've then got somebody who's sharing the risks with you, increasing the energy in the days where maybe you're feeling a bit down and they're feeling a bit more positive. You've also got someone who's in the same boat as you. And also, sometimes you can have somebody who, along your entrepreneurial journey, brings a bit more fun and maybe reduces some of the stress that you might feel if you were sort of a solo entrepreneur or a one-man band. So that's all part of the good part of the business partnership and having someone that you can work with. What I tend to find is when I'm speaking to clients or to other business owners from time to time, I do, based on my own experience, ask them a few questions, really just to see where they are and maybe have an initial discussion with them about some of the things that I've seen from time to time. So I tend to ask things like, how are things going? How is everybody working together within that business? Does each person have a clear role within the business? Are they clear what they are responsible for and not responsible for, and what they are meant to deliver against and not deliver against? And I also then just quietly ask, are there any verbally agreed rules between them? Or are there any written rules that maybe determine who makes decisions, how decisions are made, how they get paid, etc. And I also maybe suggest that now is a great time, while everything's going very well in the business, to maybe have those discussions or have those slightly awkward discussions about the business and the business future and just get them out of the way. Now, what generally happens when I ask those questions is I get laughed at, and invariably the responses are, we're getting on great, we've known each other for years, business is going well, we're really making some strides forward. Maybe we're really, really busy, we're doing exactly the right thing, and we're achieving what it is we want to achieve. And generally what they'll say is, we don't need to discuss it now. Yeah, we know about it, but we can discuss it later on. We don't need, everything's gone so fantastically well, and we know each other for so long. There's no need to have this discussion right now. And also, we're busy, we're growing the business. It's going to take some time and effort to have these discussions. We don't have time to do it now. Or they'll say, why do we need to involve accountants or lawyers? It's quite expensive. And actually, we don't have the money, and we don't really want to spend that sort of money right now in the journey of the business. And so all those responses, they're all very reasonable. They're all very expected at this stage. I don't expect to really hear anything very different to that. And they're also quite difficult to argue with. But obviously, I'm coming from a point of view of having worked as a fractional CFO for a number of years in various guises, and more often than not, I've seen these problems happen, these challenges occur, and that I have seen how they've arisen, and also I've seen the impacts of them. So all of that is good, all very, very good, but I have seen the bad. So if we move on to the bad element, and it's something, as I've mentioned already, I've seen it more often than I would like, or that most people would expect, but it does happen more often than you think. And so the way that I term it, or I frame it, is you need to think about the what ifs. What if something happens and that causes a change in your relationship or how you're working at the moment with your business partner? It's the what ifs. And so generally the sort of typical what ifs that I found have caused issues between business partners is things like, what if the contribution from one person or the other changes? You started off really motivated, really ambitious, working weekends, working late nights, and suddenly the contribution from one person or the other starts to change for one reason or another, and it's not quite what it was. What if one person actually gets involved in another business? That's not unusual as well. If you're on your entrepreneurial journey, things will pop up along the way. Opportunities might be put in front of you. And so maybe one person gets involved with another business that maybe you don't have an involvement in. So what do you do then? Does their involvement slow down a little bit? Does their focus change a little bit from what it was with your business and your partnership? What if somebody wants to work away? What if they say, look, I've decided I want to spend more time in the United States, so I'm not going to be able to work in the UK any longer, Ireland any longer. I need to go to the US for 6 months, or I want to work out of Thailand. That's a what if that does occur from time to time. Sometimes there just be life shocks. One partner or other gets ill, maybe has a serious illness where there's no coming back from. Sometimes maybe it might be marriage, or one person has children, and that changes the relationship and how they view their business. So that's another key what if. Or there can just be business disagreements. One person wants to take out a higher salary, one person doesn't. Maybe at the end of the year, one person is saying, we've got cash in the bank, we want to take some dividends out. The other person says, no, we want to invest further in the business. Maybe there's some decision areas around bringing in a new business partner, a new shareholder, or maybe there's some vision for the business, a pivot in the business strategy. And again, one person might be for it and one might be against it. These are all things that I have seen happen and do happen, and are challenges in any growing business. So that's the bad, or the what ifs, as I call it. So when you get into the bad, there's usually quite a number of questions hanging in the air once that sort of circumstance or set of what ifs happens. It's things like, well, if these what ifs happen, how do you start? How do you start to deal or resolve with those things? Where do you start? What's the starting point to try and sit down and have a discussion if the other person maybe isn't quite at that point? Who suggests it? Who starts it? What format does it take? How do you get an agreement? If you're not on the same page with something, how do you move down a process that gets you to an agreement that both people can live with and get back to normal with? And what happens to the business in the meantime? If you and your business partner aren't quite on the same page, if your complementary skills aren't quite being focused on, what happens to the business in the meantime? Do you start to lose clients? Do you start to find your pipeline falls away a little bit? It will start to impact your business one way or another. Better still, certainly from my point of view anyway, is could you have avoided those problems in the first place? Could you have done something to avoid those what ifs happening? Or if you can't avoid those what ifs or those challenges happening, is there some way or some mechanism that makes it a bit easier to get to an agreement or to get to a point where you say, look, we're going to agree to disagree. I'm going to go elsewhere. You can continue running the business. And is there a mechanism that allows it to happen as professionally and as maturely as possible? So it comes to the ugly. If you don't know where to start, if you don't know how to start, if you haven't got a means of getting to an agreement, then a really fantastic business relationship can turn very ugly very, very quickly. And what that means then is instead of focusing on the business, you're focusing on your disagreements. You're not focused on getting the new clients, delivering the service to your clients, continuing to grow the business. One or other party isn't working diligently anymore. That's going to impact the business. Even if you've got an ability to get an agreement and to agree to disagree, the simple outcome of that is one person probably will end up having to buy out the other person, purchase their shares off them. So there's always going to be costs associated with that, cost with maybe bringing in a fractional CFO like myself to try and help bring about an arrangement or agreement, maybe to put a value that people can agree on their shares. And there'll also be legal fees, definitely be legal fees. There'll be a share purchase agreement. There may be some agreements around how you can operate in the future and what information you can take onto a new venture or not. So there will be costs and fees, which will be reasonably a substantial amount. But maybe, and more importantly, what if it's not a simple outcome? What if you can't agree? No one can decide who's going to stay on the business, but they can't decide who's going to run the business. Then you end up maybe with a very significant legal issue and start working through the courts. What that means, it gets very, very expensive very, very quickly. And in many respects, what that means is the business eventually, the value of the business that was there gets destroyed completely, or the business itself is destroyed by the end of the process just by not being able to agree or get to an end point. And if you think it's stressful running a business on your own, it's even more stressful running a business when you don't agree with your business partner and everything's very frosty every day. And you can't decide who's making decisions and how to get to the bottom of your issues. And also in many cases, many business partners haven't just met each other on the day that they go into business together. Quite often they might have had some personal relationships. They might have had personal relationships to their spouses or family members. So again, when it gets ugly, you need to also think about the personal and the business relationships. They will be impacted, if not destroyed completely as well. So is there a solution to this? Is there a way of getting back to your better still? Is there a way of avoiding the issues or the challenges along the way? Or if these things do happen, if somebody does get married and have kids very quickly and their priorities change, or if they want to move to the US or Thailand for 6 months of the year and you can't get to an arrangement, then can you have something in place that makes it easier for you to sit down in a professional way and agree what you're going to do, how you're going to do it, when you're going to do it, and who gets paid what? Well, the answer is yes, in my experience. And so that's where my initial questioning comes in, saying, how's the business going? Have you written anything down? Do you have any verbal agreements? I'm a really big believer in something called a Shareholders Agreement. And so I'm just going to read this out because I think it's quite important. So Shareholders Agreement, it's a legally binding contract or agreement between all of the shareholders of a limited company. And yes, every company does have an Articles of Association, but Articles of Association only set out the formal legal relationships between a limited company and shareholders based on the company's legislation in the UK or in Ireland at the moment. It's not tailored to your business. It's very, very generic. So shareholders agreement allows you to cover off all the issues that are outside of that in far more detail. So things like the relationship between the company and shareholders, the relationships between the shareholders themselves and what they do and how they do it, and also the way in which the company is run. And so it covers off things, voting rights, decision making, sale of shares, dividend policy. But really what a shareholders agreement is all about, it's a rule book for how to handle the what ifs. All the what ifs that I talked about a little bit earlier, but also a whole raft of additional what ifs. And allows them to be dealt with in a sensible way before they become disputes or disagreements between the shareholders. And it also means that then if there is a dispute or a disagreement that can't be resolved, it sets out a roadmap to how one person or other can leave in a sensible way and make sure that they're then getting paid what they think is due out of that. So that's the formal piece. But then in broad terms, what I have is I have sort of a list of about 6 areas when I'm talking about shareholders agreements that any business owners need to sit down and need to think about, probably agree upon. So I kind of group it in terms of control decision making, who controls, who makes decisions, how are decisions made, and what happens if you can't get to an easy or immediate decision. Roles and responsibilities. What are your roles? What are your responsibilities? When are you delivering? When aren't you delivering? What do you need to do then if one person isn't? What are the rules around dealing with that? Money and shares. Everything comes down to money and shares at the end of the day. You're in business to make money. You're in business to improve your personal wealth. So money and the shares and who owns the shares and how much they're worth is really important. So that's a key area that you need to discuss when looking at any shareholders agreement. Exit and succession. So if somebody does want to leave, how do they leave? When do they leave? How do they get paid? What's the value assigned to their shares? What's that based on? Does include goodwill, does include work in progress. All these issues, again, if you can get them all agreed and written down, then at least if things can't be resolved, there is a business there that everybody can get a piece of the value from, and the person taking it on has something to take forward and not destroy the value within that business. Disputes. Shareholders agreements will always have something in there about how to deal with disputes, how to resolve disputes, how to get to a point of coming back to agreement and being able to get on with the business again. Governance and admin, again, running the business, how to keep it ticking over, and how to make sure that anything that needs to be done is done and someone has responsibility. And so my experience generally is that the process of going through building or making a shareholders agreement is actually where all the value is. Because if you sit down when everything is good, when you're in the good stage, not in the bad and the ugly stage, you're in the good stage, when you're getting on well, things are going well, sitting down, having those discussions and saying, well, what if this happens? What if that happens? And stepping through the process. How do we control and decision make? What are our roles and responsibilities? How do we deal with money and shares? What happens if someone wants to leave? How do we deal with disputes in a professional and mature way? That process is really valuable, because those discussions will either flag up issues that are maybe underlying or some minor issues that are already there and can be dealt with, so they don't then pop up at another point in time when they become a little bit more tricky to deal with. But it also means you're heading off potential problems because you'll have sat down, had these discussions, planned out the process, and therefore when these things happen, they don't get too far down the line because you've already got a mechanism in place to deal with them. And the other really important thing around the shareholders agreement as well is that once it's in place, each partner has a certain amount of peace of mind. You know what will happen if there's a dispute. You'll know what will happen if someone's spouse gets too involved in the business and it's not working and it's not working for you. You'll have that peace of mind to know that there are mechanisms to solve the problems, and also mechanisms that if it can be resolved, each person or the relevant person can exit the business in a fair way to the person staying behind. So again, I can't overstate the importance of shareholders agreements and the process of getting there. So I even say to clients, even if you don't document and make it all legal and finalize it, the process of going through it, the process of just writing it down between the 2 or 3 business partners will have a huge impact on your business, and you can get some help with that or not. But just having something in place, A, means you've got something to perhaps to work on or work through if you do have a dispute or a challenge. If it goes to court, having something written down will have a value to each party anyway. But actually, if you go and get the shareholders agreement done, you've got that peace of mind and it's all in place as well. So I've got a few real life stories, and these are really meant to showcase examples of how disputes and issues have impacted the business and how it's impacted the business where there has been a shareholders agreement in place and maybe where there hasn't been a shareholders agreement in place. So I was working with a business, a property services business, where they didn't have a shareholders agreement in place. And back in the day when it set up the business, there was a business partner who was involved at the very outset, but then stepped away and hadn't really been involved with the business for a number of years. However, because there was no shareholders agreement in place, when they started thinking about maybe selling or raising, to deal with that shareholder and either buy the person out or make sure that if it came to the point of being able to sell or exit to a third party, that person would just agree with the decision and move forward. So without a shareholders agreement, it became quite fractious. That person suddenly felt that they had been left out of certain opportunities, that if they had the chance again, they would have continued with the business a little bit longer. And obviously then the other business partners had run the business for a number of years since that person stepped away and felt a bit challenged by what they were saying. So again, it became very fractious, but eventually there was an agreement to buy their shares off them, probably at a value that was far overstated in terms of what they should have gotten, but it was the only way to get to an exit point and an end point. So with no shareholders agreement, they had to, over a long period of time, try and negotiate a deal that probably suited the minority shareholder much more than the current business owners. So I also worked with a construction business where they did take my advice and they did go ahead and get a shareholders agreement and put it in place and go through that process. And the reason they did that was because they brought in a new business partner to head up a new venture as part of their growing group. Now, whatever happened over the 12 or 18 months that new person was in the business, it just wasn't working. They weren't delivering what they were expected to, what they hoped to, and the decision was made that business venture needed to be scaled back, and there wasn't the value to keeping that new business partner in place. So because they had the shareholders agreement in place, although it was a challenging and tricky decision and a process, the shareholders agreement meant that there was a process for making that decision, communicating that decision, providing a value to the shareholding that newer business partner had, being able to pay that off, and for them to be able to exit within a certain time frame and with minimum dispute. And if they hadn't have had that, then there would have been dispute about, well, you're wrong, I'm doing really well, I'm delivering on what I wanted to. There's reasons, maybe other reasons. That means I'm not delivering, which are outside of my control. So it just cuts all of that out and then be able to exit in a very sensible and professional way. I was working with a professional services business where there were 2 partners who worked very successfully together for 5 or 6 years. They'd grown the business from about 100,000 to about 800,000. Really successful business over that period of time. And there was what I would have called a what if, a life shock. Something happened in one business partner's life that they just decided they wanted to leave the business. They just weren't invested in it anymore. And because there was no shareholders agreement, it was that classic, where do we start? How do we start this discussion? How do we value your share of the business? Is your value correct or not? And because of that, Then it got into a very slightly fractious relationship of, well, how do I leave and what date can I leave and want to leave soon? And actually, I believe the business of my share is worth this amount of money. And so eventually, through just managing your way through the process, trying to a little bit of give and take, etc., they managed to get to a resolution. One party exited, but it meant it was very fractious, and the person who stayed behind had a few issues about things that were said and done that they were very happy with. But they got there in the end. But a shareholders agreement put in place beforehand would have meant there was a certain period of notice before anyone decided to exit. There was a process for putting a valuation in place, and then there's a process for handover and various other elements that would have made it less fractious, and the personal relationship definitely fractured during that process. I also was involved with another property-related business where there were two partners, very invested, very determined, very ambitious. But one partner suddenly decided he wanted to work from a different location, and by the very nature of their business, they needed to be on location more often than not. So the partner saying, I want to work in a different part of the country, just meant that it just wasn't feasible for them to continue in the business. But given there was no shareholders agreement, then there was no mechanism to have that discussion and to agree to disagree on how things needed to work. So ultimately, they couldn't get to an arrangement, and the business essentially was closed because they just couldn't get to. Each person dug in their heels. There was nothing to make one or other relent a little bit or to come to a midpoint, and essentially it was just to have to just tell their clients they were leaving, and one client could go with whichever business partner they wanted to. But essentially, the really shocking part or the concerning part is that there was a value in that business that had been built up over the previous year or two, and that business value was destroyed, and nobody got anything of that value out of the business because there was no shareholders agreement in place and no mechanism for them to solve their dispute, and one or other person exit feeling they got a fair value out of that business. So I think at this point it's really just about highlighting, from my experience, the importance of a shareholders agreement. And it's important because although life is good and life can be really fantastic, the reality is sometimes things go bad, sometimes things change in a way that we're not expecting, and therefore it's really important to have a backup plan, a second option. And I view a shareholders agreement as being that backup plan, that option. Either, as I said, it allows you to head off the problem before it occurs, or where there's a problem, it gives you an exit route and an ability to leave in the best possible way and maybe retain a personal relationship or a business relationship. After a few months, you can then come back and say, it was a bit strained, but it hasn't destroyed the relationship and it hasn't destroyed the business, and that's the most important part. So if you are where I think you should be, then you should be thinking about your business and your business partnership and thinking, I really need to do something about this. But what you need to do is get started. It's as simple as the only thing to do is just get started. So start those discussions. What are the what ifs that could happen? Write them down. And then each person say what they think their view of it or what they would do for each of those what ifs, and they would help to resolve that. Because remember, doing something later sometimes can be too late. You've missed the boat. When you're having those discussions and you've written down your what ifs and you've written down your this is how I would do it and this is how I would do it, and perhaps bring in somebody like myself, where I've dealt with these a few times before, to try and mediate or to drive those discussions and try and get that framework written down at an early stage. So write it all down, take it away, each business partner take it away and review it, come back and do a second version. And then once you've got something that you think covers all of the likely what ifs, and if you think you've kind of got an agreement between what you started with and each person, and you come back to something you can both live with, then that's probably the point then to take it to your commercial lawyer and then ask them to review it and make sure that everything is tied up and is legal, and then to pick up any gaps, so anything that they the lawyer's aware of that needs to be included, that hasn't been included, and that then gets you to having your shareholders agreement in place. And quite often, part of the shareholders agreement process will involve maybe changing some of the articles of association in your business, but that'll be part of the legal part of it as well. Even just having the shareholders agreement framework in place will make a big difference to you and make a big difference to the business. So that is pretty much it for today. Now it's just for any questions. If you have any questions, then put them in the comments below. And what I will do is I'll respond to them either straight after this event or I'll respond to them a little bit later on. And what I'm also going to put in the comments is I'll put a link to book in a call. So if you do want to discuss your business or discuss this topic in general, book in a call. And I'll also put in a link to our scorecard. So we have a scorecard that allows you to identify 15 signs, I think it is, of where a fractional CFO might be of value to your business. And one of those signs might be issues with your business partner. So again, I'll put that in the comments so people can tackle that, download that, and find out if this is something that's on their radar. And then once you've gone through the scorecard, then book in a call. I'm happy to run through that with you. And again, then there's other things in terms of fractional CFO that I get involved with from time to time, whether that's just professionalizing the finance team, whether that's helping to drive the management meetings, the management pack reviews, budgets, pricing reviews, systems, or if you've got any particular business projects you need somebody to lead that, that's the sort of thing that I can get involved with from time to time. I'm happy to have a conversation about that as well. And finally, connect with me on LinkedIn if you're not already connected. There was some information about our YouTube channel. We've got a number of other videos on shareholders agreements, the challenges, some of the what ifs, some of the outcomes. If you go there, you'll see a little bit more about that. And then finally, just mentioned the fractional CFO scorecard that you can try, and then by all means book in a call with me if you want to discuss this. So that's it. Hopefully this was helpful. Hopefully this was food for thought. And obviously, if it is something that potentially you can see happening in your business, then put some thought into it, follow those steps, get started, do it sooner, because if you leave it till later, it might be just too late. So thank you for attending. We'll have another LinkedIn live event at the end of the month, and we'll have 2 across October and November again as well. So thank you very much. And